On television, Robert Urich was the man who brought order into chaos. He played cops, detectives, and quiet heroes who didn't need to shout to be believed. When he showed up on screen, things made sense again. Justice felt possible. Control felt real. But off-camera, there was no script powerful enough to protect him. Behind the image of strength and certainty lived a man fighting something far more relentless than any villain he had ever faced. And unlike his characters, this time there was no guarantee he would win. What most people never saw was that Robert Urich was never fighting alone. Standing beside him, through every diagnosis, every silence, and every door that quietly closed, was his wife, actress Heather Menzies. Their story is often remembered as a Hollywood love story touched by tragedy, but that framing barely scratches the surface. This was not a tale of fame gone wrong or of scandal and excess. It was the story of two people who believed in dignity, privacy, and purpose, even as the industry around them began to look away. Urich had spent his career being dependable, too dependable, some would later say. In an industry that increasingly rewarded noise, chaos, and reinvention at any cost, he remained steady. He didn't sell his private life. He didn't chase attention. He assumed the work would speak for itself. But what happens when Hollywood changes and you don't? When illness enters the picture, does loyalty still exist? Does patience still matter? And when the phone stops ringing, not with rejection but with silence, is that absence accidental or deliberate? This is not just the story of how Robert Urich died. It is the story of how he lived and how the woman beside him carried that life forward long after the cameras stopped rolling. Before he ever became a familiar face on American television, Robert Urich came from a place where fame was never part of the conversation. He was born in the quiet town of Toronto, Ohio, not Canada, to John Paul and Cecilia Monica Urich, raised in a Byzantine Catholic household with Ruthenian and Slovak roots. By every early measure, Urich was the picture of an all-American kid. He was athletic, confident, and widely liked. Football came easily to him, earning him a scholarship to Florida State University. There, he crossed paths with another young athlete who would later become a Hollywood heavyweight, Burt Reynolds. Urich played backup center on the team, but even then, it was clear his future wasn't on the field. What set him apart was how seriously he treated preparation. He earned a degree in radio and television communications, then pushed further, completing a master's degree in broadcast research and management from Michigan State University. This wasn't the path of someone chasing stardom, it was the path of someone planning a career. After college, Urich didn't step in front of the camera, he worked behind it. He took voice lessons at the University of Chicago and landed a sales job at WGN-TV, earning just $150 a week. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept him close to television. Then came the setback. His employers discovered he was moonlighting, quietly trying to break into acting, and he was fired. He tried other on-air work, even a brief stint as a weatherman, but it didn't take long for him to realize that standing in front of a green screen wasn't his destination. Acting wasn't a sudden gamble. It was the one thing he kept circling back to. Looking back, people who knew him during those years said the same thing. Robert Urich never believed success would be handed to him. He believed it had to be earned step by step, without shortcuts. The only unanswered question was whether Hollywood still rewarded that kind of patience. When Robert Urich finally arrived in Los Angeles, nothing happened overnight. There was no dramatic entrance, no instant transformation from unknown to star. What came first were auditions, rejections, and roles small enough to disappear if you blinked. His first television appearance came in 1972 with a guest spot on the FBI. It wasn't a breakout role, but it was enough to get his foot in the door. A year later, he landed what looked like a major opportunity: the lead role in the television adaptation of Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. On paper, it was a big break. In reality, the show collapsed almost immediately, canceled after just 6 episodes. For many actors, that kind of failure would have been discouraging. For Urich, it was simply part of the process. He didn't panic. He didn't reinvent himself. He kept working. That same year, he made his feature film debut in Magnum Force, the sequel to Dirty Harry. Starring Clint Eastwood, Urich played a motorcycle cop with a vigilante edge, a darker role that hinted at a range television rarely allowed him to show. It wasn't a starring part, but it mattered. Hollywood noticed that he could hold his own on a big screen, next to one of the most powerful stars of the era. Still, nothing about his rise was smooth. In 1975, another familiar figure from his past reappeared. Burt Reynolds, now firmly established in Hollywood, urged Urich to read for a new action series being developed by television powerhouse Aaron Spelling. Urich auditioned for SWAT, and almost immediately he was cast as Officer Jim Street, the calm, disciplined counterweight to the show's explosive energy. SWAT became a hit almost overnight. Viewers loved the action, the adrenaline, and the sense of order Urich brought to the screen. But just as quickly as the show rose, it fell. Critics attacked it for excessive violence, and by 1976, the series was canceled. It was a pattern that would follow him again and again: success, followed by sudden erasure. The question was no longer whether Robert Urich had talent. It was whether Hollywood would ever let him keep the momentum. By the late 1970s, Robert Urich had reached a turning point. After a string of near misses and short-lived successes, Hollywood finally gave him something he could hold onto, a role that fit him perfectly. Reuniting with television powerhouse Aaron Spelling, Urich was cast as Dan Tana in Vega. Set against the neon glow of Las Vegas, the series presented him as a stylish private investigator with muscle, discipline, and quiet authority. To prepare for the role, Urich committed fully, adding nearly 40 pounds of muscle and transforming his physical presence on screen. The result was immediate. Vega became a hit, not because it was flashy, but because Urich made it believable. He didn't play Dan Tana as a reckless cowboy or a loud enforcer. He played him as a professional, someone who thought before he struck, someone audiences could trust. That trust mattered. Viewers welcomed him into their living rooms week after week. The show earned Urich 2 Golden Globe nominations and firmly established him as a television leading man. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving in Hollywood, he was anchoring it. But even at the height of success, the pattern lingered. By its 3rd season, Vega began to slide in the ratings. Network support faded. In June 1981, ABC quietly canceled the series. The lights of Las Vegas went dark, and once again, Urich found himself starting over. Still, he didn't disappear. In 1985, he returned to television with Spencer for Hire, portraying Private Detective Spencer, a tougher, more streetwise evolution of the characters audiences already trusted him to play. The series ran for 3 seasons and spawned several television movies, allowing Urich to inhabit the role long after the weekly episodes ended. By this point, Robert Urich had become something rare. Not a tabloid star, not a scandal magnet, but one of television's most reliable faces. When he appeared, viewers believed the story would make sense in the end. The question was no longer whether he belonged at the top. It was whether the industry around him would stay the same long enough to keep him there. By the mid-1980s, the television landscape that had once embraced Robert Urich was quietly disappearing. Not collapsing, just evolving in a direction that no longer favored men like him. Networks were chasing younger audiences, sharper edges, and stories that leaned into moral ambiguity rather than reassurance. The hero was no longer meant to restore order. He was meant to question it. Characters became louder, darker, more unpredictable. Anti-heroes replaced professionals, sarcasm replaced restraint, and chaos, once the problem to be solved, became the product itself. In that environment, Urich's screen presence, calm, controlled, dependable, began to feel almost out of place. What's important is this: Urich didn't resist the change out of stubbornness. He simply didn't believe in it. He had built his career on the idea that television offered something stabilizing, a sense that stories could still land somewhere solid. And he wasn't willing to dismantle that belief just to stay fashionable. He kept working, relentlessly, professionally, without complaint. Series like Gavilan cast him as a former CIA agent turned oceanographer, a thoughtful role that fit his instincts perfectly. The show was well crafted, but audiences had already shifted. It was canceled after 7 episodes. Other projects followed. TV movies, limited series, guest appearances. None failed because of him. None succeeded enough to carry him forward. Behind closed doors, a quiet reclassification was happening. Urich was no longer discussed as a leading man. He was talked about as a safe pair of hands, reliable, professional, predictable. In an earlier era, that description had been currency. Now, it sounded like faint praise. What made this period especially revealing was what Urich refused to do to correct course. He avoided talk shows built on confessional spectacle. He didn't share personal struggles for sympathy. He didn't cultivate controversy. He believed, almost stubbornly, that if the work was honest, it would eventually speak louder than noise. Some colleagues admired that. Others worried it made him invisible. People who worked with him during these years would later say there was no bitterness in him, only quiet confusion. He hadn't changed. His work ethic hadn't slipped. His performances hadn't weakened. Yet, opportunities were thinning. Hollywood hadn't rejected him. It had simply moved on. And in an industry where silence often replaces explanation, the most unsettling question was this: if stability was no longer valued, what place was left for someone who had built his entire career on it? In 1996, just as Robert Urich appeared to have found steady ground again, everything stopped. He had just starred in The Lazarus Man, a Western drama that finally allowed him to age naturally on screen, not as a fading action hero, but as a man shaped by experience. The series was well received. Critics praised his performance, and the network renewed it for a second season. For the first time in years, Urich wasn't chasing momentum. He had it. Then came the diagnosis. Urich was told he had synovial sarcoma, a rare and aggressive cancer of the soft tissue. It was not the kind of illness that allowed for denial or delay. Treatment had to begin immediately. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. His life shifted overnight. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. There were no press conferences, no public pleas. Urich did not ask for special treatment. He did not ask production to hold the show for him. According to people close to the set, no one even asked whether he could continue working. Instead, the production company, Castle Rock Entertainment, quietly canceled The Lazarus Man. There was no official explanation tied directly to his health, no conversation about accommodations, no discussion about timelines. One day, the show existed. The next day, it didn't. For Urich, the shock was not just the illness, it was the speed with which he was erased. Later, he would say something that revealed the depth of the wound. They never asked if I could still work. They just pulled the plug. That sentence would come to define this chapter of his life. Hollywood had not fired him. It had simply stepped away. As treatment intensified, Urich continued to do what he had always done: work. He hosted documentary programs, he narrated, he appeared where his strength allowed, but something fundamental had shifted. The industry that once valued his reliability had shown how conditional that value really was. And yet, Urich did not retreat into bitterness. Instead, he turned outward. He became an advocate for cancer awareness, speaking openly about early detection and research. Alongside his wife, Heather Menzies, he helped establish the Urich Fund at the University of Michigan Comprehensive Cancer Center, directing resources toward research and patient support. When he later appeared on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and won $125,000, he donated the entire sum to cancer research quietly, without ceremony. In 1998, doctors declared him cancer-free. For a brief moment, it seemed like survival might also mean return. He was named a national spokesperson for the American Cancer Society and resumed acting, hosting, and even preparing for stage work. But the silence from Hollywood never truly lifted. The question lingered, unspoken but impossible to ignore. When a man survives cancer, should that mark resilience or risk? By the time Robert Urich was declared cancer-free, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The industry had moved on without him. In 2000, Urich made a decision he had never wanted to make. He filed a lawsuit against Castle Rock Entertainment, citing breach of contract over the abrupt cancellation of The Lazarus Man. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't fueled by anger. It was, by all accounts, a last resort. What Urich wanted was simple acknowledgement, not sympathy, not charity, just the recognition that he had been removed without conversation, without assessment, without the basic professional courtesy he believed his career had earned. The lawsuit was settled privately. No details were made public. No one officially admitted wrongdoing. And on paper, the matter was resolved. But Hollywood doesn't operate on paper alone. After the lawsuit, something subtle but unmistakable happened. Urich wasn't blacklisted in any official sense. No studio memo circulated. No doors slammed in his face. Instead, the phone stopped ringing. Agents would later describe it carefully. No one ever said, "Don't hire Robert Urich." They simply stopped saying his name. This kind of silence is difficult to prove and even harder to fight. In an industry built on relationships and momentum, absence can be more damaging than rejection. Projects came and went, roles were cast, meetings happened without him. To those who didn't know the backstory, it looked like a natural career slowdown. To those inside the business, it felt like something else entirely. A quiet, cautionary tale. Urich had challenged a system that preferred compliance over confrontation. What made the situation even more unsettling was his response. He didn't lash out publicly. He didn't name enemies. He didn't frame himself as a victim. In interviews, he spoke calmly, even generously, about the industry that had failed him. That restraint, some believed, cost him dearly. Hollywood has always celebrated resilience, but only when it's convenient. Survival is admirable, litigation is not. And Urich had crossed an invisible line. He had reminded the industry that loyalty should cut both ways. The unspoken message was clear. He hadn't just survived cancer. He had survived it without disappearing quietly. And in Hollywood, that can be unforgivable. The question now was no longer about justice. It was about consequence. After the lawsuit faded from public view, Robert Urich made a quiet decision, one that would define the final years of his life more clearly than any role he ever played. He refused to be seen as a victim. Urich understood how Hollywood treated illness. It either turned suffering into spectacle or erased it entirely. He chose a third path. He limited public appearances not because he couldn't stand in front of a camera, but because he didn't want sympathy to become his identity. Those close to him said it was a deliberate choice. He wanted to be respected as a professional, not remembered as a tragedy. Physically, the battle had taken its toll. Surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation had reshaped his body and drained his strength. There were days when simply standing required effort. Yet even then, Urich continued to work where and how he could, hosting documentary series, narrating programs, and staying connected to audiences without placing his illness at the center of the story. What surprised many was not his endurance, but his generosity. Rather than retreat inward, Urich became an advocate. He spoke publicly about early detection, about research funding, about the reality of rare cancers that received little attention. Alongside his wife, Heather Menzies, he helped establish the Urich Fund at the University of Michigan Comprehensive Cancer Center, ensuring that resources reached patients who often felt invisible. There was no press tour, no self-congratulation. When Urich later appeared on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and won $125,000, he quietly donated every dollar to cancer research. The act wasn't framed as heroism. It was framed as responsibility. Privately, those closest to him began to repeat a sentence that was never officially attributed, but deeply believed. Robert Urich did not want to be remembered for how he died, only for how he lived. That philosophy guided everything. He avoided appearances that traded on pity. He rejected narratives that reduced him to a diagnosis, and he never spoke as if survival made him special. To Urich, dignity wasn't bravery, it was baseline. In 1998, doctors declared him cancer-free. The announcement brought relief, but not celebration. He understood the fragility of remission. Still, he accepted the role of national spokesperson for the American Cancer Society, using visibility not to spotlight himself, but to normalize conversations others were afraid to have. For a brief moment, it felt like balance had returned. Work resumed. Advocacy continued. Life cautiously, moved forward. But beneath it, all lingered a question Urich never voiced aloud. If strength could not guarantee security, what, then, truly defined a life well lived? Long before illness entered their lives, Heather Menzies had already learned how fleeting fame could be. She had known the spotlight early. As a child, she became part of one of the most beloved films in cinema history. The attention came fast, bright, and overwhelming, and like many who experience fame too young, she understood something most never do. Applause is loud but temporary. By the time she married Robert Urich, Heather was no longer chasing visibility. She was building a life. Their marriage was not performative. It was private, deliberate, and rooted in shared values rather than shared headlines. When Urich's career surged, she didn't compete with it. When it slowed, she didn't push him back toward the noise. And when illness arrived, Heather did not step forward as a public figure. She stepped inward as a partner. Those close to the family would later say that Heather became the axis around which everything turned. She managed schedules, treatments, conversations, and silences. She shielded their children from unnecessary fear while refusing to lie to them. And she did it without drama, without public statements, without asking to be seen. In Hollywood, there were quiet rumors that she had been offered opportunities to return to the screen interviews, retrospectives, nostalgia-driven appearances. She declined them all, not out of bitterness, but because she didn't want grief to become content. What defined Heather during this period was not sacrifice, but clarity. She understood that staying didn't mean standing still. After Robert's first remission, she helped transform their private battle into public purpose, continuing their shared work with cancer research and patient advocacy. She didn't speak often, but when she did, it was never about loss. It was about continuation. People who knew her well said she avoided the phrase, "moving on." She preferred something quieter, more honest. She spoke of continuing the work, continuing the values, continuing the life they had built together even as one half of it grew fragile. Heather never tried to preserve Robert as a memory frozen in time. She carried him forward instead, in choices, in actions, and in the way she refused to let tragedy define the story. The question that lingered wasn't whether she survived what came next. It was how she chose to live with it. By late 2001, the optimism that had followed Robert Urich's remission began to fade. Doctors discovered new lumps. The cancer had returned. Publicly, Urich remained measured. He spoke carefully, saying new medication was working, that there was reason to hope. Privately, the reality was more fragile. His body had already endured years of treatment. This time, the margins were thinner. In April 2002, just days before his death, Urich was admitted to Los Robles Hospital and Medical Center in Thousand Oaks, California, suffering from severe breathing complications. There was no dramatic final announcement, no farewell interview, only the quiet understanding that time was running out. On the 16th of April 2002, Robert Urich died at the age of 55. His wife Heather and their 3 children were with him. 3 days later, a funeral mass was held at Street Charles Borromeo Church in North Hollywood. The service was restrained, dignified, and private exactly as he would have wanted. Urich was cremated, and his ashes were later placed at the family's vacation home in Prince Edward County, Ontario. A modest memorial stands nearby, not as a monument to fame, but as a marker of presence. There was no public spectacle, no industry-wide reckoning. Hollywood acknowledged the loss briefly and then moved on. Heather did not. In the years after Robert's death, she carried his work forward with quiet determination. She expanded the foundation they had built together, raised funds for cancer research, and supported patients and families navigating the same road they once had. She rarely spoke publicly, and when she did, she spoke without bitterness. She had already survived ovarian cancer once. She understood how thin the line was. In November 2017, Heather was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. The timeline was devastatingly short. Less than 4 weeks later, on the 24th of December 2017, she died at the age of 68, surrounded by her children. Her son would later say she was not in pain, only tired. Tired in the way someone is when they have finished what they came to do. First, Robert, then Heather, not with scandal, not with chaos, but with a quiet finality that mirrored how they had lived together, privately, and without asking the world to watch. What remained was not outrage, but absence. And sometimes, absence speaks louder than any headline ever could. When Robert Urich and Heather Menzies spoke about family, they rarely spoke about success. They spoke about presence. After years of infertility and multiple miscarriages, adoption was not a consolation, it was a choice made with intention. Their first two children, Ryan Urich and Emily Urich, arrived in 1978 and 1980. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1998, they welcomed Allison Grady Urich, completing a family built not by biology, but by commitment. Friends often remarked on Robert's parenting style. He didn't dominate rooms. He lowered himself to eye level. When Ryan got into trouble at school, Robert didn't lecture. He sat on the floor, opened a conversation, and listened. Correction came second. Understanding came first. That approach left a mark. When Robert's cancer returned during Ryan's final year of high school, the family entered its most fragile chapter. Ryan drove his father to chemotherapy appointments, navigating every bump in the road with painful care. Watching his father suffer and being unable to stop it changed him. Robert died in 2002, just as Ryan was studying biology in college. Years later, Ryan would say that moment reshaped his life's direction. He had watched medicine fail someone he loved, and instead of turning away from that pain, he ran straight toward it. Today, Ryan is an infectious disease specialist in New Mexico, working in communities where care is scarce and impact is immediate. Emily followed a similar path. She chose nursing, becoming an emergency room nurse, a profession defined by urgency, compassion, and quiet resilience. Those who know her say the choice wasn't symbolic. It was practical. She wanted to help where it mattered most. Allison, the youngest, has chosen a quieter life, away from public scrutiny. But like her siblings, she grew up surrounded not by celebrity, but by service. What's striking is what none of the children chose. They didn't trade on their parents' names. They didn't pursue legacy as recognition. They didn't remain in the orbit of Hollywood. Instead, they carried forward something less visible values. After Heather's death in 2017, the children continued supporting the foundation their parents built. Scholarships, cancer research funds, and community programs still bear the Urich name, not as branding, as continuation. In Toronto, Ohio, a highway interchange now carries Robert Urich's name. On Hollywood Boulevard, a star marks his place in television history. But the truest memorials are harder to photograph. They are found in hospital corridors, in exam rooms, in lives changed quietly, without applause. The Urich legacy was never about being remembered. It was about being useful. And in that sense, it never ended. Hollywood has never lacked tragic endings. What it rarely offers is an example of how to live with restraint, dignity, and purpose when the spotlight no longer guarantees protection. That is why the story of Robert Urich and Heather Menzies continues to matter long after the cameras stopped rolling. Urich spent decades portraying men who seemed unbreakable detectives, cops, figures of control, and quiet authority. Yet the truest measure of his strength emerged only when that control was stripped away. He faced illness without turning it into performance, rejection without turning it into resentment, and mortality without surrendering his sense of self. In an industry that often discards people the moment they become inconvenient, he insisted on remaining present, professional, and purposeful. Beside him, Heather chose a path that Hollywood rarely celebrates. She did not convert grief into visibility or tragedy into relevance. Instead, she continued the work they had begun together, supporting cancer research, helping patients and families, and protecting their children from a life defined by spectacle. Her silence was not absence. It was intention. Their legacy was never designed for headlines. It lived quietly in hospitals, in research centers, in scholarships, and in the lives of their children who chose service over spotlight, medicine over myth, and contribution over recognition. That choice completed the story in a way no award ever could. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on why. Not because it shocked you, but because it challenged you. Consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. What does dignity look like when fame fades? And what kind of legacy truly lasts? And if you value stories that look beyond scandal and noise, remember to like, subscribe, and support this channel. By doing so, you help keep these quieter, deeper Hollywood stories alive, stories not about how people fell, but how they stood.